so more people can watch us, because technically you have to register to be on Zoom.
Yeah.
And you know, some people, they just don't want to give the information, which I understand, even though there should be social trust between us, and we're not going to sell their data. Okay, I think we should be live on YouTube now.
Excellent.
Fine. So thank you, Professor, for like accepting to talk to us tonight. So Students for Liberty, for those who don't know, is an international network of campus groups where we promote liberty in all its forms, so political, economic freedom, social freedom. We are right now present in more than 30 countries, and we started 10 years ago. So for the ones who are still students, because you know, as we graduate, some of us are already young workers entering the economy. So if some of you are interested, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll see how we can work together. So that being said, I decided to invite Dr. Professor Bjornskov because of, well, the crisis and a topic that's really dear to me, which is social trust and its impact on prosperity, on economic prosperity. Because I think it's something that's not really on the what do you call that, the sunlight. It's not a topic that's really I think talked about enough, because it's not really easily measurable. It's not like a lot of things you can measure, and you can maybe measure their impact on the economy and on the prosperity. Social trust is harder, I guess, to measure. And yet I think it's like crucial for like a healthy economy to work. And it goes even beyond that. I suppose, Professor, you will talk about that. And it's especially true in that time of public health crisis, where you can see that different countries opt for different measures, and you can see how people accept them more or less. And depending on how, you know, they trust their governments, it shows in polls and etc. And I think it's really important, because it has like tremendous consequences on the very like efficiency of the measures that can be taken. And also in general, it means something in terms of the freedom that's preserved for people, because then you get into like a relationship between people and government, where people don't trust the government and the government doesn't trust their people back. So it can lead to the worst, in my opinion. So we'll probably learn a lot about like yours tonight, and I'm really happy to just leave you the stage.
Thank you. Just let me know, how long do I have in total? Or?
Well, it's really up to you. Usually we plan on like a total of an hour, which is already enough of your time, I suppose. And technically it's like 20 minutes or 25 minutes, 30 minutes. I mean, as long as you want of presentation of your ideas. Yes, I missed all of my homework. I didn't present you. So Professor Bjornskov is a Danish economist. He's a teacher at Aarhus University. He got his master's and his PhD in economics there, and he has different areas of interest in research, like, well, social trust and informal institutions, but also public choice and new institutional economics. But you maybe can tell us a bit more about your areas of research and interest, probably better than me in the very short description that's available online.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm first of all happy to be here, even though it's only virtually. I'd, of course, much prefer to be physically present in Paris, but that's not possible these days. So I do stuff, basically. My research area is more or less what I'm interested in. And I've done a lot of stuff on social trust. That was a core of my PhD dissertation, embarrassingly many years ago. And it's been a continuous research interest of mine. I've also done quite a bit on economic freedom, and in particular, how economic freedom changes the way societies work. So I'm very happy and thrilled to talk to you today. But today it's about social trust, and let me just see if I can share my screen if that works.
Yeah, you have the tool right at the bottom of the screen. There's a green button,
and I get a message saying that I host disabled participant screen
so
saving, but
I can just do it for you then.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I know. To download it.
So while you do that, just let me.
Yeah, I'm doing it. I'm downloading because I have to download it first.
Oh yeah, no problem.
And then should be.
So anyway, while you're doing that, I can advertise. I'm also affiliated not only with Aarhus University, where I'm professor, but also with what's called the IFN in Stockholm, which is the oldest private research institution in Scandinavia in the social sciences. We also do social trust research up there and economic freedom. And they have a great, here we go.
So you should
the IFN has a great working paper series that's for free. Anyway, this is basically it. It's about social trust and economic prosperity. And if we just flip to the next slide, the question really is, what is social trust? Because we know what trust is, and we trust our parents, we trust our dear friends, and so on. Social trust is a bit different in the way that it's the degree of trust you have in the man in the street. You trust other people to be honest and to do the right thing. And of course, that's a very fluffy concept. But it turns out that across the world, we can actually pretty much agree on a set of commonly accepted social norms. Don't steal, for example. Don't cheat people. Don't tell gross lies. If you promise something, you keep the promise. We all, whether we live in France or Italy or Bangladesh or Peru, we agree that that is important. Those are the things you ought to do. Social trust is actually your belief that other people that you don't know will abide by those norms. So they're not going to cheat you, they're not going to steal from you, and so on. So it's different from the trust you have in your family and friends. You know them. You have emotions involved with them, right? It's also different from the trust you have in your colleagues, because even though you don't like your colleagues, you have a future with them. You know that if you cheat them today, your colleagues are going to be misbehaving towards you in the next week, and they're not going to collaborate with you next week. So that's a different kind of trust. And it's also a different kind of trust from the stuff you have in parliament or politicians or the police or the judicial system, because they have particular roles to play in society. You know what the police and the judicial system is supposed to do, and you can also pretty much see if they do that. So I would be pretty trusting towards a French judicial system. I don't trust the Russian one, because we know something about how those things work. But social trust is really trust without that kind of information. You just know that those guys out there are somehow living in your society, and your social trust is the degree to which you trust them. And the point is, as you can see in the next slide, that belief really, really differs a lot across the world. So Florent, if you're just flipping to the next slide.
Yes.
Excellent, thanks. So you can actually see that the black column is France. When you ask people in general, do you think most people can be trusted, or do you have to be careful? about 23% of the population in France say, yes, you can trust other people. France is a bit lower than the average, actually. The worst and the best countries, if you just push once again, then they're going to pop up, are places like Brazil, Peru, Turkey. It's also Trinidad, it's Rwanda, and it's the Philippines, where fewer than 10% of the population say that you can trust other people. In Brazil, it's actually only 6% who think that you can trust other people. In Scandinavia, so Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, it's about 66%. It's actually very close to 70% in Denmark and Norway who say you can trust other people. And the thing is that those kinds of survey-based measures, we just ask people, turn out to be really good predictors of how people actually behave. So last year, a new study came out where a group of French researchers had handed in lost wallets in 355 cities around the world. And they saw how many of those wallets actually come back to the owners with the money and everything intact. In Scandinavia, the vast majority of wallets came back. In some places, like for example, China, only 7% were returned to the owner. And we know that in countries where people say that most people can be trusted, they also behave in a more trustworthy manner. It actually picks up their behavior. Scandinavia sticks out. The Nordic countries, which is Scandinavia plus Finland and Iceland, actually stick out as probably the most trusting places in the world. Brazil sticks out too, the probably least trusting place in the world. And the thing is that those things actually shape how those societies work, what you can do with institutions, what you can do with other people, and how you do those things. And in some sense, we sort of know these things. That France is such a low trust country was, of course, a bit of a surprise for us. The average in Germany is 38%. That's about the same as in the United Kingdom, where it's about 40% who say that most of the people can be trusted. But it's not as bad as Greece or Cyprus, where in Cyprus only 14% say that most of people can be trusted. So even within Europe, even in within the EU, this varies really a lot.
Do we know? I don't know if I can ask questions in
yeah, of course. Yeah.
But I was wondering to which degree maybe the homogeneity of a country can,
yeah, it was
that kind of result in social
trust. In the late 90s, when the first of these studies were published, people believed that the homogeneity of those countries really matters. That was where the ethnically homogeneous countries were the most trusting ones. The big problem for us now is the more we got to know about trust around the world, the less did it look like that. So Trinidad is one of the least trusting places in the world. It's very, very homogeneous. The same goes for Denmark. It's very homogeneous, one of the most trusting places in the world. If you go just below the Scandinavian level, you get places like New Zealand and the Netherlands that are actually quite ethnically diverse. So what we know now is that it has in some sense to do with this history of the country, but not really with the diversity. It's just something else that shapes this level of social trust. And as I'm going to come back to, it's something that is remarkably stable over time. It somehow has to do with your deep history. Anyway, those things are really, really important. So if we flip to the next slide, it turns out that social trust is easy to see. So the Nobel Prize winner Kenneth Arrow said almost 50 years ago that virtually every commercial transaction has within it an element of trust. So you can think about how often yesterday you relied on the honest behavior of some stranger. So if you shop for groceries in your supermarket, you rely on the honest behavior of the cashier, that she gives you the right money back if you paid with cash. If you go for a coffee, when we can do that again, you rely on the guy in the coffee shop to actually give you the kind of coffee that you paid for, and not some much worse coffee. And in Western countries, in modern complex societies, we have those anonymous transactions with people all of the time. So if you have a very, very, very backwards, small society, everyone knows each other, social trust is not important because you very, very rarely meet someone who you don't know. But the more advanced society gets, the more complex it gets, and the more social trust becomes important in your everyday life. And it actually turns out to shape our education decisions. It shapes our political behavior. It shapes the demands that we have in politics. It also shapes commercial contracts, and it shapes the way the bureaucracy works. Let me give you an example of how big it is when you talk about commercial contracts. If you buy something as a company, you usually write a contract. But the length of that contract actually varies quite a lot. So contracts are typically longer in France than in Germany, because in France, you put more things into the contract. In Germany, there are things that you don't need to put into the contract because you trust people enough to know that, well, if this happens, we can figure things out together. If you don't trust that, you put those things into your contract. A few years ago, I gave a talk in southern Denmark for a group of directors. And a director of one of the large suppliers of agricultural equipment came up to me during break and said, well, we know this. He told me, we never write contracts on any purchases below 2 million euros. It just doesn't pay. So the further you get up towards high trust countries, the shorter do contracts become, and the more common does it become simply not to write any contract. And of course, if you can trust the guy that you're dealing with, it's cheaper not to write a contract, because contract requires lawyers and a lot of time and effort. So even at the very basic level, the way you do economics, the way you do commerce, the trust element, the trust culture shapes exactly how you do that. And it's just easier. The Dutch economist André van Horn showed a few years ago that also means that what countries become good at and what countries can sell to the rest of the world, so their exports, is shaped by our trust culture. It's easier to sell things to the rest of the world with elements such as quality or design or whatever that you just can't write into a normal contract. So the more you trust those guys to deliver things, even though you can't write contract to ensure that they deliver the right thing, the more can they sell those things. So if you think about Scandinavian exports, they are very often things with niche products or designs, Scandinavian furniture, for example. And we can sell that to the rest of the world exactly because of our trust culture. Because there are things that can't be written into a contract. If you're a low trust country, it's almost impossible for you to start selling those things because people are not going to trust you to deliver the right design or the right level of quality. And if you do that anyhow, you have to have a very long history of showing that you deliver the right things. That's what French agriculture has. But a lot of other French companies can't do the same because they don't have the history of delivering year after year the right quality. It's much, much easier for companies in high trust countries. It also shapes a lot of other things. Yeah.
No, I thought you were done with that slide, and I just
am.
wanted to chip in to ask one of the participants questions. But
Yep.
Please go ahead if you aren't done yet.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll get it if I can make it appear.
Yeah.
Right here. So yes, so Simon Sarevsky asked you, are some countries bound to have lower social trust due to their culture, or more precisely, can we say that, for example, a Hindu country will have on average a higher or lower social trust than a Christian one due to moral foundations of the culture? You briefly talked about it, I suppose, but maybe if you want to
Yeah, well, I'm going to come back to that at the end, but it turns out that religion as such doesn't really matter. So across Christian countries, you have very high trust and very low trust countries. Even across India, across Hindu India, you have states that are higher trust and states that are lower trust. So it's really not what you believe. It turns out it's more or less to do with how strong you believe what you believe. It's about religiosity, and religiosity is actually detrimental to trust.
Yes, if I can jump in, I remember hearing a podcast about they were comparing basically the prosperity of different countries, and they were taking examples the US, Mexico, and India. And they said that in India you could see, it was true also in Mexico and the US, but more in India and a little less in Mexico, and even less in the US. In India, people will trust. That's interesting because they will trust their family way more than other people out of a tribal, setup. So the companies were doing more poorly because they could only transfer the ownership or the leadership of companies to people within their family, because they wouldn't trust enough other people outside of the tribe. That was true of Mexico, but less than in India. And in the US, it was way less true. So
that's a very good point. It's actually something we also know from West Africa, that companies tend to grow up to a size where you employed all of your family and your friends, and then they stop growing because trust levels are so low in parts of West Africa that you're never going to employ anyone that you don't know, anyone from outside your family. And the same thing goes for transferring the ownership of companies. You only transfer it within your family in those areas. So it actually puts a lid on commercial development in those countries. Anyhow, if we flip to the next slide, there are a number of other things that's going on. A telling difference, I think, is always labor markets. So labor markets in Denmark, which is one of the highest trust countries, works in a very particular way. Since 1899, we've had this settled system that labor unions and employers organizations negotiate labor contracts, usually every second year. And they just negotiate wages and regulations and so on in different parts of the labor market, and that's it. And government doesn't intervene unless those negotiations completely break down. And completely break down usually means that they have 2 weeks where they just can't agree. Only then does government step in with any kind of legislation. So it actually means that most of the labor market in Denmark is completely unregulated by government. It also means that it's much more flexible, because if you have one sector where companies are doing really poorly, you can negotiate the wage down so people actually keep their jobs. And if another sector is working really well, they are probably going to negotiate wages up. In France, government centrally decides on regulations, contract constraints, and minimum wages. We also don't have any minimum wages set by government in Scandinavia. And it all rests on the trust that you have in other people. So in Denmark, we trust that our labor unions and employers organizations are going to do the right thing for us. And we trust that employers are going to follow those labor contracts. Once you have a deal, they're going to follow the deal. And employers trust that labor unions and employees are going to follow the deal once you have a deal. If you don't have that kind of trust between parties, you can't have a voluntary negotiation system like the Danish or Finnish or Icelandic one. And then you're going to end up in a regulated labor market like the French one. And we actually know that this is true for a lot of other regulations too. the less you trust other people to follow common norms or common promises, the more you actually want government to go in and force them to do that. So last 10 years, a lot of research has actually shown that that high trust countries just regulate both differently and regulate the economy much less than low trust countries, exactly for that reason. So high trust countries tend to become more economically free than low trust countries because the voluntary non-government solutions actually work really well. Now, this isn't the only thing that trust does. In the next slide, you have a few other examples. If we flip to the next slide, yep. One of the really big things is the overall quality of institutions, that quality of the bureaucracy, it's the quality of the judiciary, how well and how effectively, how fair it works, and to some extent also the quality of the police. And the interesting thing here is that if you look carefully at the figure is from a chapter I wrote for an Oxford handbook a couple of years ago. The black triangles represent autocratic countries. The white circles represent democracies. And you can see a very clear association between trust and how good the judiciary system is in democracies. But the autocracies are just one blob. And it's one of the things that we take as indications that a lot of this works through the way we behave as voters. So imagine a situation where you trust other people. It means that if some politician turns out not to be trustworthy, there's a scandal around her, or she does something very, very stupid, it's easy to find alternatives. You're simply going to vote for someone else because most alternatives are going to be more trustworthy than that guy. Now, in those countries, politicians know that. They know that they're really risking their political life by engaging in corruption and scandals and so on. So even the bad politicians in those countries are to some extent going to behave as if they were good politicians. And then you're also, at the end of the day, going to get much better decisions. You're going to get politicians who don't mess around with the judicial system. On the other hand, if you're in Cyprus or Greece, where you don't really trust other people, you might have a politician who is somehow involved in a scandal, but you're still going to vote for him because there are very, very few good alternatives. Most people are people you don't trust. So the normal democratic mechanism that if you have bad politicians, you just vote for someone else, that mechanism actually works better the higher the level of social trust is. So you can actually see, if you look at the two lines, the very low trust countries, the very low trust democracies are on average similar to autocracies. The high trust democracies are the ones that are really different. So we know that our trust actually affects the way we behave politically. And that, in the very long run, means that high trust countries who turn democratic are going to get better judicial systems with less corruption, fewer scandals. And let me give you an example of what a scandal is. So I know France, certainly also Italy and Spain have had a number of political scandals over the years. 10 years ago, there was a political scandal in Denmark. It turned out that the then Minister of Financial Affairs couldn't account for the purchases of about 110 euros. And that almost cost him his political life. 110 euros. If I tell that to my Italian colleagues, they just laugh at me and say, yeah, that's a lie. They just can't imagine that that would be a scandal in Italy. You can do much more in Italy before people just perceive it as a scandal. It means that high trust voters are actually much more sensitive to the behavior of politicians. And in the very long run, that means that high trust democracies just work way better. Another thing is education. And for some of you, this might actually be interesting. So if you flip to the next slide.
Yeah.
Education is one of the very, very first places where this line of research really made an impact. It was down to an American sociologist called James Coleman. Coleman, who had read and knew a French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu, who had this idea of what he called social capital. Coleman had similar ideas, and Coleman and Bourdieu actually exchanged ideas. Both of them used the other one. Coleman's idea was that students have more access to help in high trust societies. They're more likely to help each other. Essentially because if you're in a low trust society, helping means I help you now if you help me now. So we exchange help and that's it. In a high trust society, I might help you now if you help me sometime in the future. And in very high trust societies, I'm going to help you now if I believe that someone in the future is going to help me if I'm in the same situation. Essentially, we just extend the help further out from our immediate network in a high trust society. And that help is important in the educational system. So Coleman actually showed that in high trust areas in the US, much fewer students drop out of high school than in low trust societies in the US, essentially because they get that kind of help. Now, the other thing that we know is that once you have an education, you want to be employed in a nice job. The big problem with nice jobs for educated employees is that they are very, very difficult to monitor. It's really, really easy to see how well you work if you just churn out plastic thingies. But if you have a complex educated job, it's very difficult for your employer to see if you're doing the right thing and if you're working hard or if you're just slacking. So if you hire people in those kinds of jobs, you want to screen the applicants. You want to make sure that the paper that you have from a university is actually genuine, that you went to university or you have this degree or whatever it is. And you want to interview them before you hire anyone, because in a low trust society, you're risking that you're going to get the wrong employee and he's not going to do his job. Once you've hired someone in a low trust society, you're going to spend resources in management, in monitoring that people actually do their job properly. But the higher the trust level is, the less you actually have to monitor employees, to use resources on that. The less you have to use resources on interviewing and screening applicants and so on. So it actually becomes cheaper both to hire people with an education in high trust cultures, and it's going to be cheaper to have them employed in your firm because you don't need all the time to look at whether or not they're doing their job properly. So in the long run, this also means the high trust societies are going to hire or want to hire more educated people. And they're going to end up with having a better educated population for these two reasons. And it's one of the reasons why Scandinavia, to some extent the US and the United Kingdom, are pretty nicely educated. And if you go to Southern Europe, particularly to Southern France, to Southern Italy, to Southern Spain, to Greece and Cyprus, you have much, much lower general educational levels. So in that sense, this also means that just the incentive to take education is different in a high trust country. Finally, if you flip through to the next slide.
Yeah.
Thanks. These things, the better education, the better institutions, the easier commercial contracts and so on, simply mean that high trust countries in the long run become richer. If you look at the typical low trust country around the 10% mark, they have average incomes of about $10,000. If you look at the very high trust countries, that's 50% and above. That would be New Zealand, Australia, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, most parts of Canada. They typically have average incomes that are at least 4 times higher, because those societies just work in a very, very different way. And that's one of the reasons why we as economists are really interested in trust and these trust differences, not just because that they work better, they work in a more voluntary way, they regulate less, but also because with that trust comes other things. And that's actually, I think, one of the last slides, if you flip through that again. They're different countries to live in. So we also know that high trust countries have much more satisfied populations. If you live in a trusting country and you forget your wallet in a cafe, you just go back and pick up the wallet. It's no big deal because you don't expect anyone to steal it. I know from Greek colleagues that if you do that in Greece, they just expect the wallet to be gone. And that's going to be a worry in everyday life. These very high trust countries work in the way that people simply don't have to have a lot of the worries that you need to have or should have in really low trust countries. And all countries are sort of in between that. But it just means that life is easier. Even though you're not rich, life is going to be easier. Another thing that's actually very, very easy to see is the way we deal with social hierarchy, because there are social hierarchies in all countries. Some people are rich, some people are poor. But my favorite example is actually a comparison between Sweden and France. In France, if you meet the president, you'll probably call him Monsieur le Président. And sorry for my poor French.
That's okay, it's perfect.
Good. If I was to meet the Swedish prime minister, I would call him by his first name. I'd certainly call the Danish prime minister by her first name. Because even though they have this status, in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, we don't take that status difference as seriously as in other countries. So one of the things that you can actually see in these high trust countries is that even though you have differences in wealth between people, in the social sphere, people just don't take those differences seriously. So I regularly play tennis with a guy who teaches at high school, a guy who's a carpenter, and a guy who works in a warehouse. Formally, we have huge differences in social hierarchy. No one cares. And that's one of the things that really set these high trust countries apart in a social way, that you don't take those differences seriously once you leave work. Also means that a lot of voluntary solutions typically work better. So we know, for example, that people are just better at cleaning up the environment. They're better at following environmental advice in high trust countries, again, because we expect other people to do the same thing. So if I'm in Denmark, I expect other people not to throw litter in the forest. If I go to, say, Russia, I almost expect people to do that because no one else expects people to not throw litter in the street. So why would you not do that? So people actually work anonymously in a different way together. And we end up having more tolerance towards other lifestyles. If we just expect other people to be honest, to do more or less the right thing, we are more tolerant towards them living very, very different lives than ours. Because the way, what is really important to us, that you can trust other people to behave honestly towards you, is there. And then you're fine with them being very different. Unfortunately, this also means that it actually becomes difficult to integrate foreigners. So we've integrated Bosnians and Vietnamese extremely well in Danish society, but we have difficulties integrating foreigners who come from very low trust countries. because they often do things that we consider dishonest, but they consider normal. And that means that a lot of foreigners will actually, if they're not really aware of how society works differently, they're going to do something that we think is not right. And they're going to do that without realizing that we don't think it's right. I'm going to end there with that this backside to the medal, that there are things that are going to work in a different way. I'm also going to just, at the end of my talk here, the last slide, emphasize that this doesn't mean, it really doesn't mean that you can't be rich without having a high trust society. So Florent, if you flip to the last slide.
Oh yeah, sorry, I thought that was the last slide.
Yeah, thanks. The thing is, social trust is actually very, very stable over time. So we know that communism destroyed trust in the East Bloc, so the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. We also know that the East-West difference in Germany, the difference between the old communist part and the old Western part, is still there. It hasn't changed since 1990, even though East Germany has had good legal institutions and a normal, free, democratic society for 30 years. The difference is still there. We also know that Americans' levels of trust are shaped by where their ancestors came from. So typically, Americans with ancestors from Scandinavia are still among the most trusting Americans. Americans with ancestors from Greece and Turkey are typically among the least trusting Americans. Because those things, the trust level is something that you learn in your family. And even in Africa, you can see that in areas where more slaves were caught, you have less trust today in other people. So those things are really deep historical differences. Doesn't mean that you can't get rich, but it means that if you live in low trust countries, there are just some routes to development that are blocked. There are some ways of getting rich that you can't use. It simply just means that if you live in a high trust society, there are more ways as a society of becoming rich. It's easier. And that's basically what I think we've learned the last about 20 years about economic prosperity and social trust.
Well, thank you a lot. We have a few questions on the chat. Might have answered to some of them briefly already, but still I'll ask them. So the first one is, isn't the causality between social trust and government intervention reversed? With an addiction effect, statism and central government intervention destroys social trust of people. I don't know if you understand the question because of the way I spoke. If you need me to,
I think I get it. I mean, we know with communism that if you have government intervention to that degree, it does destroy trust. But it's very, very heavy intervention, not just in the economy, but in your life. So, for example, in East Germany in the mid 1980s, 4% of the adult population worked for Stasi, for the secret police. And if you have that level of government intervention and you have that level for generations, it's going to destroy trust. But we have seen the way government intervention has varied a lot. If government intervention was something that created or destroyed trust, we would have expected the East Germans to become like the West Germans the last 30 years. But that hasn't changed at all. And that's one of the several ways we can be fairly sure that it's trust that affects government interventions and the way society works, and not the other way around. Because we have these almost perfect experiments like East Germany that becomes like West Germany, or the Czech Republic that over time, since 1990, has become pretty much like Austria. But trust levels haven't changed.
Okay. Well, I would before going on the second question, I was wondering if so a heavy level of government intervention or intrusion can like destroy social trust to some extent. But I wonder at the same time if there's not a reverse mechanism that would actually make people try to be more, to help each other more, precisely because the government is so tough on people. And I'd say that you have a lot of people like in Russia or in ex-communist countries who sometimes regret. So maybe it's like, I'm sure there's a lot of things that go into play to make them think it was a good time, and that people were more like cared about each other more. But I wonder what's your position on that.
I think it's fair to say that in Eastern Europe, for example, government actually destroyed a lot of trust. But what that did was that people got together in closed circles where they knew each other very well, and they had a lot of trust in each other. And they tried to make things work in that way by getting together in these fairly closed circles. But that's because social trust gets destroyed, and you try to replace something. You try to replace a social trust with something else. That's these very tight, close, very nice networks that a lot of East Germans now remember fondly from the communist time. But you have to remember that those kinds of networks, you can actually also see it in, for example, southern Italy, where people have very low levels of trust in each other. But they have these very, very close-knit villages. Those kinds of networks are reactions to a loss of social trust.
So it's maybe more like a tribal trust more than it doesn't go throughout all society. It's like it's really limited. It's really strong, but really limited. And indeed, it doesn't help to increase economic prosperity. Okay, thanks. So the next question is, how do trust levels compare between Western Europe and Eastern Europe? Holland has a history of social tolerance. Meanwhile, countries such as Poland have endured ethnic cleansing and communism. So again, that's like what we've been talking about.
Yeah. On average, just on average, all other things being equal, Eastern Europe is about 10 percentage points less trusting than Western Europe. And we're pretty sure that is just something that was destroyed by communism. Because if you look at Americans whose grandparents emigrated in the 30s and 40s, so before communism, there's not that difference between East and Western Europe. But now there is a difference. So that's one of the reasons we can say that it's communism that destroyed those 10 percentage points of trust in Eastern Europe compared to Western Europe. And unfortunately, the only place where you can see that things are getting better is Estonia. Social trust levels have been increasing since 1990 in Estonia, but only among Estonians who speak Estonian, not among the Russian ethnic Estonians.
Some tribal trust here then.
Yeah.
They know that Estonia is really far more free, far freer than like a lot of Eastern countries. So that, again, that I guess would play into your research. I mean, that would like favor the outcomes of your research.
Yes.
So the last question is, what are the determinants of social trust? And I suppose that's probably one of the hardest to answer, if answerable at all.
Well, it is answerable to some extent, but it is also a very, very hard question. We know two things for sure. The one is communism. We know communism destroys trust. So we can see Eastern Europe. We can also see that in countries like Laos and Cambodia that have been communist and had horrible histories. The other thing is something very, very weird. And we discovered that totally by mistake. It's random discovery. Turns out that monarchies are more trusting. So if you have a king or an emperor or whatever it is, you're likely to be more trusting. And it's about sort of 8 to 10 percentage points. So it's actually a pretty big difference. It's fairly accurately the difference between French and Spanish trust levels.
So whatever the kind of monarchy, like if It's like a parliamentary monarchy, or?
I mean, it even seems to be the case with, for example, Thailand, who's also a monarchy, but not parliamentary. It's at best a very unstable democracy. What it turns out to be is that you seem to have one actor that's outside of politics, who might not have any influence really, like the Danish or Belgian kings or queens don't have really any actual influence. But if something is wrong in Danish society, the Danish queen will tell the Danish population in her New Year's speech. So if a politician says that, we couldn't care less. But if the queen says, this is not good, you have 5 million people who are listening to it. So we actually think that monarchs very often can keep bad developments in check. The other thing is that you have this non-political figure that's just common to whomever you are, whether you live in Copenhagen or Northern Jutland, or whether your parents immigrated from Palestine or they've been here for 1,000 years. The queen is the same, which also actually it fits with the fact that we know that the royal family is actually very, very popular among migrants in Denmark. But that's the other really weird thing that we know. The last thing, of course, is that we know that history matters. But exactly what kind of history matters is very difficult to say. So we have thought hard about whether the French Revolution and the hugely violent years after the French Revolution is one of the things that destroyed French trust. Because if we look back further than the French Revolution, France doesn't look that different from northern Spain or southern Germany.
Okay, we have another question that just like came in, which is, I don't know how long you still have on your clock.
No, that's on your clock.
Fine. So the question is, what about institutions? What are your ideas about Robinson, Acemoglu, and economists who think that institutions matter for economic growth, not really ideas, culture, or values?
Well, I think that by and large are right that institutions are really important. I've talked to Jim Robinson about that not that long ago. I think we agree that institutions are really, really important. But institutions are not created in a vacuum. So some countries have better institutions because of their culture, because sometimes of their politics. And part of that culture and politics is the level of social trust. As we talked about earlier, trust really shapes what you do as voters, and therefore also what kinds of choices politicians can make. So I don't think I don't think Acemoglu and Robinson are wrong in fact that institutions matter. I think it's fair to say that, and it's very intuitive for me, that if you don't have an institution that protects your private property, you're not going to invest in that country. But the institutions are also shaped by things such as culture.
So to break that's my question. But so to break that vicious cycle of lack of social trust that you see in, let's not say communists, so we don't like offend them. Let's say authoritarian countries.
Yeah.
Because I guess that's true of like authoritarian countries just as much as communist.
Well, actually, no.
Actually,
no. I think that what's different from normal authoritarian to communist countries is a lot of authoritarian countries will not do anything to your life if you're not a political threat. So that was the case in Brazil under the military democracy, the dictatorship. If you weren't a threat to the military dictatorship, you could do whatever you wanted. The second that you become this communist dictatorship or something like that, the dictatorship also tries to affect your private life. So even if you're not a threat, it tries to direct your private life and your private values. And that's where the difference is. And it's something that all communist countries have done, and some authoritarian countries also do.
Fine. So I was just gonna. So my question was was basically that to break that cycle, that vicious cycle, then can we, or is it, would it be possible, like we saw in Estonia, and if we believe that it's because of the increase in economic and in general freedom, that they are doing better at a faster rate than other countries around them? Do you think that like letting people be freer will eventually, at some point, because it's not like magical, it doesn't happen overnight, will help build that social trust that can only flourish if people are led to, you know, make bad decisions or bad choices and good choices? Because there's going to be, I guess it also brings like social pressure into play. But
well, I think that that's much more reason to hope for free societies than unfree societies. So one of the things that seems to be the case in Estonia is that Estonians now, once they're free, have been really good at re-establishing what they were at some point in the past. So in the past, Estonia was culturally very, very similar to Finland. Finland, by the way, was the first place in the world where women could vote, even though it was part of the Russian Empire at that time. And Estonia was very, very similar to Finland. So in many ways, very modern, probably very trusting before the Soviet Union occupied it. And what the Estonians have been able to do is to re-establish also as a sort of common story about who they are, that this is what they are. They're not a Soviet low-trust country, they're like Finland. But I think that can be done if you get this common story about who you are. And the big problem is that you have to show that to your children. If you tell your children once they're old enough to understand, then it's probably too late. So this is one of the fun things, one of the fun areas where economists have learned a lot from child psychologists. They tell us that this basic sense of trust in strangers is something that you copy from your parents very early in your life. So probably like the first 4 years. So really, if you want to change trust levels, it starts with your behavior towards your children and what you show your children towards other people. It can be done. We can see it done in Estonia. We can also see that it was re-established in Germany after World War II, because trust levels right after the Nazi regime collapsed were very, very low. But they seem to have returned to what they were like before Nazism. But it does require this sort of common story that everyone buys into.
okay, and we have a last question, which is, so in the economic literature, economists such as Knack and Kiefer or Alzina argue that social trust is sensitive to polarization according to several dimensions in society, such as income inequality or diversity.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Those arguments.
So I know Phil Kiefer. I knew Steve Knack very well. He unfortunately died last year. They did a paper that was published in 1997 where they suggested that it's probably due to this polarization in society. And I think it's fair to say that Phil doesn't believe that anymore, because we have just seen more and more cases where you have these polarized societies that are high trust and not polarized, very homogeneous societies that are low trust. What seems to be the case, I would think, that's where research is right now, is that it's not really how polarized you are, objectively speaking. It's how polarized you believe you are. that's also, inequality might be perceived as fine, or it might be perceived as very unfair. But it's the perception that affects trust, and not the inequality per se. So we think that it's unfair that some of the Russian oligarchs are so rich, because we know that they cheated and bribed themselves to their wealth. We probably also think that it's perfectly fine that Ronaldo is really rich, because we know how extremely good he is as a footballer. So it's not really inequality per se, but it's our ideas of how it comes about, and it's really our ideas of how fair society is, much more than it's inequality or polarization or whatever.
Really interesting. So we don't have any more questions. So if you guys want to jump in, because we are gonna cut off otherwise, you're welcome to do so. And otherwise, everybody's gonna be free to, well, in France, we're question of matter of culture, we eat later than like in Scandinavian countries. So maybe you already have eaten, Professor.
We are becoming more like France in that respect.
Well, I was gonna say that's because of the lockdown, but you guys, I mean, at least as far as Sweden is concerned, there's no real lockdown. Oh yeah, we haven't talked about like that, but it would be interesting to see how the
Well, I can actually add one thing before we lock down here, and that is that it turns out in a very, very new Swedish study that came out last week, that high trust Swedes are more supportive of the Swedish government's decision not to lock down the country. Low trust Swedes would have liked to lock down the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, very well.
Yeah.
Thank you a lot for taking the time to speak to us. I hope you enjoyed it too. And thank you for everyone who attended. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.